This episode's sponsor is unique because they offer enterprise virtual CISO services. Think about rental CISO service on demand. If you are a CIO or a CISO looking for a way to build your defense, to build your IT security program, or obtain a virtual backstop that you can engage at a tactical and strategic level, go to redzonetech.net to learn more. Again, that's redzonetech.net. Hello, and you're listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast, and I want to welcome you to the show today. I'm excited to bring to you my interview with Brian McKenzie. I first learned about Brian when I was training for my first Ironman, and I read his books about endurance and mobility, and he changed my concept of what was possible for my own health with running. Basically, I'd just been jumping out, lacing my shoes up, pounding out the miles, and getting myself hurt. And I thought there's got to be another way to do this. And that's what Brian does, is he relentlessly tests assumptions, he challenges conventions, and he's developed innovative training approaches to optimize human performance at the very elite levels down to the normal levels like myself. Well, the irony is I'm not training for an Ironman now. So the irony is I was recently reacquainted with Brian's work when I started training with Wim Hof's cold immersion and breathing methods in Poland and with Wim's online training. And I thought, who in the United States is also sharing this interest? Like what's been the impact in the US so far? And lo and behold, Brian's name popped up. Well, just a quick story. I've been experimenting with a lot of the things we talk about related to oxygenation of the body, breathing and coupling it with meditation, and incorporating breathing with cold immersion. And so there was a lot of serendipity with Brian and I getting connected. And the interesting story as well, my son, who's 13, decided to buy a training mask recently. And now why he bought this, I don't know, but I think it's because he thought it was going to help him as a soccer player by learning how to train with the oxygen jet that the mask creates. Well, during the interview, I just brought this up because I thought Brian might know something about oxygen masks, and sure enough, he did. And he taught me a few things during that part of the interview as well. But basically, Brian McKenzie is a human performance and movement specialist. He's the innovator of endurance, strength, and conditioning programs, and he studied performance and movement for more than a decade with altitude, hypoxia, breathing mechanics, heat and cold exposure. And he's also competed in Ironman himself and also the Western States 100 and the Angeles Crest 100. And these 100-mile races are rough. I would say they're harder than even Ironman. So he's definitely lived from both ends of the spectrum here. And he's co-authored the book Power, Speed, Endurance and the New York Times bestseller Unbreakable Runner. Brian has founded and created Power, Speed, Endurance, which was formerly known as CrossFit Endurance, which specializes in movement, skill, and strength development for sports, with an emphasis in running, cycling, and swimming mechanics. He's also the co-founder of XPTLife.com with big wave surfing legend Laird Hamilton and Gabby Reese, which focuses on breathing, movement, recovery, and nutrition. Brian teaches programs about 50 seminars per year on average since 2007, and he's been featured in Tim Ferriss's New York Times bestseller, The 4-Hour Body, and has been a guest on Tim's podcast show with Laird Hamilton and Gabby. And I'll link up to this on the show notes as well if you're interested in listening to it. And Brian continues to work with lots of professional and elite level athletes in sports like triathlon, running, MMA, swimming, cycling, rowing. And he's worked with the Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, and other military special forces units. So some of the takeaways you'll get from this show are how you can change anything with 10 breaths, using breath techniques to amplify, deepen, and quicken meditation benefits. Also, the power of breath to stabilize mood regulation and reactive behavior patterns. Also, the importance of diaphragmatic breathing and how to use breathing to access flow states for high performance personal states, proper breathing techniques for sport, business, and life, and the importance of mobility and keeping your tissues supple, eating principles versus fads to follow, and the impact of sugar on diet. This episode is dense, and there are lots of books, people, videos, and other links and resources we discuss on this. So I'm going to link up to all of these at redzonetech.net/podcasts and different ways you can reach out to Brian as well if you're interested. So thank you for listening, and your patience with this introduction. Now on with the show and my fun conversation with Brian McKenzie. Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I interviewed leaders who inspire me in the areas of exponential technologies, business innovation, entrepreneurship, thought leadership, enterprise IT security, neuroscience, philosophy, personal development, and more. Welcome to the show. Brian, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Appreciate it, man.
Well, I'm super interested in learning a little bit more about what your understanding is the power of breath. And I'm going to take this a couple different ways, but you have been exposed to some breathing techniques, which I want to hear about your perspective on what is going on that allows you to reach such a deep state during the breathing and in between the breathing that approaches a meditative experience.
Several things. So one, I started with the basic 10-week course with Wim Hof stuff. I have a relationship with Wim Hof and Inner Fire through xptlife.com, which is the website, the business that I've started with Laird Hamilton and Gabrielle Reese. And that stated, Laird and I really started this about 2.5 years ago at this point, where we immersed ourselves through the 10-week course, saw immediate changes, saw immediate ways that we could apply this, started applying it, started playing around with it. And then as I have progressed, I've started to understand more of the basic fundamentals of breathing in itself, meaning specific mechanics representative of that. And there's some deep layers in here, but the fact is it's like there are specific muscles that are responsible for initiating, like the diaphragm at first, and then we can travel up through the chest, and there's specific muscles in the back, the serratus anterior up front, the serratus posterior up back, etc. And we start to, if you become aware of these things, there's ways to get things to start to fire or to start to feel these things, and that's largely been my career. Not with breathing per se, but my career's been about movement and understanding that. And I've done a pretty good job with running and running mechanics and understanding that, and a lot of sports and a lot of movement specific stuff through human movement and human performance. And I've always kind of been, I have to feel what's going on. I have to be able to articulate that and maybe be able to cue somebody and get that out. And so what we've done is we've more or less started to morph a lot of this stuff to where we're starting to activate things, whether I'm using a training mask to get activation out of something, or I'm using palpations, or I'm actually using other breathing practices prior to using the Wim Hof method. I think the Wim Hof method is probably the basis, the foundation of what it is I do. There are a lot of other pieces in there. I do a lot of apnea training as well, a lot of the freediver stuff, a lot of the pranayama stuff, to where we're getting better at CO2 retention, we're getting better at breath holding techniques, we're getting expansion of the rib cage, we're starting to really train a lot of these muscles and start to feel these things that are absolutely needed in better breathing mechanics. And so with the application of these things, I've learned how to more or less bring them together and use them together. And that's largely what we've been doing kind of with XPT Life.
So when you say bringing these together, what's interesting is that my 13-year-old son is a high-level soccer player, and for some reason he went out and he saw something about a breathing mask, and he went out and bought it.
Yep.
He bought the breathing mask, and the other day he was injured, and we went out for a run together. We were trying to get a little training in. He goes, "I'm going to wear the mask." And and it was funny because I'm not sure what happened, but he's a very good athlete, and he was out there way out in front of me and with this mask on. And then he ended up falling way back to me after a certain period of time. What is going on with that breathing mask that you're coaching athletes on to kind of optimize their performance?
A few things. One, it's resistance. So there's good and bad things about that. Too much resistance can be detrimental in terms of developing better breath holding techniques. Okay, building too much musculature around the breathing mechanics can inhibit the breathing mechanics, where what we're trying to do even with the apnea stuff is expand or open up or think mobilize. So there's the negative side on it, which is why we don't use it necessarily every single day. The positives on resistance is it's triggering you to actually use that diaphragm immediately. because the diaphragm's used, and most people are not doing diaphragmatic breathing. Most of us are seated way too much, which is largely shutting us down. Unless you sit in perfect posture and know what you're doing, you're not breathing with your diaphragm. You're breathing through your chest and your shoulders, and that becomes a very detrimental thing. And a lot of people have been talking about this for a long time. But by applying the training mask, you automatically will start to change that position and start to use that diaphragm. So I can get somebody to start to understand a lot of motor control issues that might be happening. And by motor control, I mean technical issues. So if we've got movement or technique issues, that we can largely make some changes with people by just utilizing the training mask in either a warm-up scenario, whether we're doing some sort of core warm-up, or we're even in a seated position and we apply the mask and get them to breathe correctly for 10 breaths or so, and then go into the breathing by taking off the mask and just applying that rhythm. So it's something that where, throwing a band around the knees and activating the hips and getting the hips fired up, the same thing is what we're doing with the training mask. We've found early on that getting a respiratory warm-up with something like this allows an athlete to develop a better warm-up. And then lo and behold, the research started coming out and following and dovetailing that exact same thing, where they're seeing if you get a respiratory warm-up along with your normal warm-up, you're actually going to be better off for what you're going to do if it has anything to do with more high-intensity work. So since we'd like to do a lot of high-intensity work, that's become part of our staple warm-up that we would do, a few times a week. Moving from there, there's also the CO2 adaptation. So this is probably why this kid went out really quickly and then started to fall really hard. That mask is trapping more CO2 inside the mask. So your indicator to breathe is CO2. So think swimmers. And during a swim season, so I used to swim and I played water polo as well. Beginning of the season, everything was always harder. By the end of the season, you didn't need to breathe as much. You didn't need to take as many strokes, and this is the ability to process CO2 at a higher rate, which is also involved in fitness. So the fitter we get, the better CO2 adapted we get, and the body starts to respond that way. So that was most likely what was happening to this kid, is the CO2 kind of caught up with him. He wasn't really ready for that, and he literally had to slow himself down in order to keep up with the demand of how much CO2 was being held in that mask.
When I was training for the Ironman and doing swimming, the coach I had would say, hold your breath, 4 strokes or 7 strokes or 8 strokes. And
Yep.
It's similar adaptation.
Yep. Very similar adaptation.
So when I was out in Poland doing the Wim Hof training, one of the big things that came up was the proper breathing mechanics through the diaphragmatic breathing. Is there something, and in the yoga classes that I attend, there's some teachers that are really deeply aware of the diaphragmatic breathing, et cetera. How do you teach someone to breathe so they're not panicked all day long, that they actually have diaphragmatic breathing? Is it something you just have to become conscious of continually, or have you found like a way to kind of hack that so that you become more conscious of your breathing throughout the day?
I think it's both. Yes to both of those.
Okay.
One, I think there's no reason why every human being shouldn't be practicing some sort of breathing practice, regardless if it's Wim Hof or it's something else. I've just found for me that the Wim Hof stuff works great. My wife finds other things that work better for her, and lots of other friends like other things. That said, the ability to have a practice where you're spending 10, 15, 20 minutes or more consciously aware of what you're doing with your breathing has a infinite response to that. Meaning, and I like to correlate it like this, breathing and being conscious of it is like peeling that ugly layer of the onion. Even though it doesn't seem like it would do anything, the fact that you become aware of that onion and peeling that ugly layer, you're now opening yourself up to get deeper within the stratosphere of you, per se, and allowing yourself to kind of start to venture into more of the stuff that's, brought around the ego, or even how I'm moving or how I'm breathing. And so the basics of understanding just how to breathe correctly, I mean, there are so many videos on the internet that people could Google about diaphragmatic breathing, but the fact is everything initiates from that belly, and the belly should pull first. Then it follows up through the chest. And we don't want to shrug, but we want it to travel upwards into the chest. From there, the exhale happens and it goes chest back down to belly, and the belly should collapse in and come back down. That doesn't mean you can't have a stable belly, By drawing in the lower abdomen, you still have access to the diaphragm. But from a mechanical standpoint, if we're in any sort of an anterior pelvic tilt, which a lot of people tend to be in, especially when they're standing, you don't have access. So runners, for instance, most runners have a slight overextension going on. So meaning they're in an anterior pelvic tilt. They don't have access to their diaphragm. You really cannot initiate the diaphragm while being in this position. So it's understanding and getting that place where we're laying down on the ground, kind of in a sit-up position with the knees bent, and the ability to draw from the belly first, maybe by just simply applying a hand on top of the belly, and then allowing that to move upwards. And just practicing that itself can change everything. Then it moves onward as something gets more consistent. You get more serious about the breathing, and you start to funnel into other breathing methods or other things you could be doing. I have a saying with the teaching that I'm doing, especially with the Wim Hof stuff, there's really nothing that 10 breaths can't change. And if you can get 10 breaths, if you're in a bad mood or if you're not feeling good or something's going on, it's just apply 10 breaths and see what you can do after those 10 breaths. And apply them fundamentally from drawing from the belly up through the chest, letting go, letting the air exit, then going right back again and doing 10 breaths like that. And I don't think I've ever seen somebody probably 1,000 at this point that I've been teaching with that didn't see a positive response from that.
Yeah, I mean, I have, as an entrepreneur, and I've been meditating for probably about 20 years. I haven't experienced, and I've tried I've been to Zen monasteries, I've been all over the place studying different techniques. This is by far, what you're explaining is the most direct hack to an hour and a half or an hour or 45 minutes of meditation that I have experienced.
Yes, and that's what I experienced as well. And at first it was like, oh great, yeah, now I can do this for I could do 10, 15 minutes of breathing, and I've got some great meditation going on in that period as well. Now I use the breathing and then go into some more meditation. So I can get myself into a heavier space and then be able to just sit there and meditate afterwards and be much more focused, because we're shutting down all that overthinking, the logical brain, and we're shutting all that stuff down and teaching ourselves how to deal with a lot of the hormones, the catechinoids, like with the norepinephrine, adrenaline, the dopamine, and all that stuff coming into the system, which is a very primal fight or flight type situation, and not letting that overactive mind have any access to it, so that we're actually just being very calm and ready and steady and being able to manage better decision making, whether that's in business, whether that's in personal life, or that is in a very life-threatening situation. Making really radical, really erratic decisions is never a good situation. Sure, it can pan out sometimes, but most of the times it doesn't.
Yeah, I've had that same experience. In fact, the mood regulation part of this, the more exposed you are in business or in kind of more extreme jobs or whatever, but in my experiences, the mood regulation has become much calmer. And maybe that's also coupled with being in the ice and the breathing together. I'm not sure exactly, but have you experienced that? Have you had people of this 1,000 that have talked about mood regulation?
100%. Yep, absolutely. That's been a huge part of why I've stuck with this. It's just my reactive behavior has been, a lot of it's been suppressed. Some of it's still there, but a lot of it has been just, I'm like, this is of no benefit for me to be reactive about this right now.
So we've talked about the breathing. What about the ice and the application of the ice and the breathing? Do you look at them as two independent things, or do you, well, clearly they're independent, but do you look at the application of both together as a stabilizing force, or how do you approach the ice as you go about your training?
I think definitely there's something that works together. They don't always need to be. That said, I like how they work together, but I'm going to go a step further and saying, we actually like to use the breathing, the ice, and heat. And we like to take them all to kind of the upper ends of where we can handle the cold or where we can handle the heat, and to just get the physiological responses, so that we're not necessarily going to get hypothermic because we're in too long, because we're then going to get into the heat. But inevitably what happens is we start to make the physiological changes and the adaptations to things. That said, I still do the cold training on its own, and it's something that I've learned a ton from, in that it was a very, scary thing at first that I was doing, and I wasn't able to do as much as I thought I could do. And, that's progressed. And now it's the understanding the reactive behavior to the ice and not even having that. So basically I can walk up to the ice, get into the ice, not have a single reaction to it, get into the ice, go through my time in the ice and get out without ever having a single reaction that is negative, whether I'm shivering, whether I'm freaking out because it's too cold. The fact of the matter is all those things are going to be present potentially. Maybe not the shivering, because I've learned how to suppress that, but the cold's always going to be cold. It's how you manage that with your head and letting your head get out of control. And the fact is the first thing people do when they get in the ice is they react, and they're like, oh, wow, oh my god, it's too cold, it's I got to get out, it hurts. And that's just the head. There's no reason why anybody can't handle that. So staying in a little bit longer and then going and get into the heat and seeing how you can really get through that really peels layers for people. And that's one of the profound things that we're doing at these XPT experiences that we put on, which we have one starting tomorrow in Malibu. And we introduced this entire thing. And it is by far, of everything we do, it is by far the ice is the hardest thing for people to wrap their head around doing.
Yeah, it is. And, I've been doing the ice training since November, and having gone through the Wim Hof videos and then flying out to Poland. And by far the ice has been, coupled with the breathing, been the most powerful, transformative. So the programming that you have, I'll put that on our show notes page so people have access to that to learn more about how they can get involved. Basically, you're teaching people how not to panic, basically, and then how to breathe their way through it.
Yeah, and that's what the breathing's for.
Yeah.
Is the breathing, is there, like, look, let's say you have reactive behavior towards your wife because she upsets you about something. That's what the breathing's for, is to learn how to not do all that. How do you apply this into your daily routine? And the ice is there to do this exact same thing. It's how do you get over that reactive behavior towards the ice and allow yourself to own it. There's two people up from Australia right now that we ran into that are getting ready for a CrossFit Games competition. And they're in town, and the guy, it's winter down there. He says it's freezing, and he's looking for a place to do some heat. And I have a sauna, and I told him to come up. We could do some ice and heat. And they don't necessarily do the ice training, and I set them up to do the ice training, and I showed them how to do it. And they absolutely killed it by understanding not to react to the ice. And they were both dumbfounded how much easier it was to get through that by not reacting to it. They were just baffled because she was like, it didn't feel like it was that cold. And I was like, right? And it was like 38 degrees, you know?
Yeah, and it's stunning. What also I think for the listeners is that this is not about some macho, run into this and run out like one of the cold plunges. I'm in the Northeast, but they'll these cold plunges where you jump in for 4 seconds. This is a very conscious entering, right?
Yep. It's very, very conscious. It's very, very aware. And I also like to show people, hey, stick your hand in the ice right now without doing any breathing. Feel that. Now, do 30 breaths and then stick your hand in. And they're just like, whoa, why didn't that hurt as much? And it's like, well, you're suppressing the pain receptors. You're raising the pH, so you're not allowing the pain receptors to be in a mode to be as reactive, so that you can literally handle more than you typically could.
I've been searching for, and you probably know much more about this than I do, the vagus nerve.
Yep.
I would love to hear what your take is on the vagus nerve, the breathing, and the ice, and how you've been able to piece it together. It seems like you've made a career out of piecing together these disparate technologies, human technologies, and pulling them together.
Yeah. I've done a fairly good job at some of that stuff. A lot of the vagus nerve stuff is going to have to be done through the nose, which is why a lot of the stuff in yoga is done through the nose.
Okay.
Is you're getting that connection through the nose. There's also techniques with like the Tibetan chant where you hear the Tibetan meditation stuff where you're hearing them.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
That is vagal nerve stuff. You're literally vibrating sound off the roof of the mouth and using the tongue to generate the different movements and create a calmness that goes through that vagus nerve and literally transcends down through into the diaphragm, around the heart, the lungs, all of it. So if we get somebody in the ice, typically we'll get them to nose breathe, to just slow it down, do slow controlled nose breathing. And lo and behold, they just start to calm down much quicker.
So, okay, a nose breathing basically is a way to activate that, to activate the vagus nerve and bring that more of a settled state to the brain and to the
Yep.
body. So I'm going to take a bit of a leap here, but I know you'll be able to track with me on this. So Stephen Kotler wrote the book Rise of Superman,
Yep.
and I'm sure you're aware of this. And
Steven's a friend.
oh,
Yes.
okay, great. I'm hoping to have him on the podcast next month or so. But I am also heavily into the technology world with Singularity University and exponential technologies. And one of the big areas is neuroscience. And I've been very interested in the flow states and achieving flow states, being an athlete myself. And would you consider the state that you are able to achieve from the breathing and the ice and the approach of this, would you achieve, and the reaction you get from people to be slipping into a flow state?
100%.
Ah, okay. Because
Yep.
Stephen talks about.
We actually,
Okay.
I just did a talk, a 2-hour talk on Sunday at a yoga shala down here, where I show up once a month and we do some breathing stuff, and it's got specific topics. And the topic this last Sunday was flow, and how we get there, and how we get the, how we would use the breathing to get there and stay there. Where the breath holding, the exhale retention is maybe not the best idea if you're going to go into some athletic event, because it's pulling out all the oxygen after you do the breathing. You're pulling down the oxygen again and then having to bring it back up. That said, we're still using the breathing to get up and get into these states. We're just doing less of a retention, and then we're able to stay. And the idea is that you're focusing on what it is you're about to go do, regardless of what that is. It doesn't even need to be a sport. It could be going to work. Like, hey, I'm driving to work and I could be doing some breathing. Like, I just get myself into a mode to concentrate on the task at hand that I want to accomplish, and then I'm setting myself in that focused motivation.
That is something that I totally get. And I took a bit of a risk asking that question, but I think that without a doubt, I feel like I'm in a flow state when I'm tapped in.
Yeah, I mean, we're doing this stuff with Laird all the time, and he's doing it before he's towing into, I mean, massive waves. He's out there breathing the whole time. So I've probably worked with, 20 professional surfers at this point, some of the top guys in the world, and I would say 80% of them have stated immediately, this is exactly what it's like when I'm barreled. And you can almost make a decision prior to having to make a decision, and seeing into the future and being able to be in that place where you need to be when you're just, it's like time doesn't exist. I'm like, flow. And they're like, yeah.
Gotcha. So the mechanics of that from the surfing point of view, so, from the Wim Hof piece, it's that full breath in and then that half breath out, full breath in, and then you exhale completely. So is that what you're referring to as on the full exhale?
The full exhale retentions, we don't do them as long when we're getting somebody ready to go compete or train.
Gotcha.
Because it just drains. If you do that, you're just draining out all the oxygen. So you're just basically wearing that's why it's such if you do a bunch of exhale retentions, you feel kind of wiped out afterwards.
Sure.
That's why.
Okay.
Because you're draining out all that O2 versus keeping all that O2. So we'll do less than 1 minute breath retentions. Then we'll do a 10, 15 second inhale retention to reset the system, and then go right back into it. And so we set that up to where we're getting somebody ready. Or I'm just having an athlete breathe on the start line and just getting the O2 up and getting the pH up. And then the gun goes off and they don't feel anything for 45 seconds.
Okay. Now, so I went to my Spartan training today with the group that I meet with, and I listened to you talk about nose breathing as it relates to going through a workout with just doing nose breathing. First question is, how do you do that the entire session? And then what is the benefit other than I feeling my belly getting focused on my belly? Is that what you're trying to do with that nose breathing, is get that deep diaphragmatic inhale?
A few things. Yes on that. And then there is getting you to be able to handle slowing the breathing down and getting into more of a rhythm with what it is you're doing. I don't think it's something you need to be doing all the time. I think it's something you maybe are doing once or twice a week. But the ability to slow yourself down, for instance. So with CrossFit, they have their CrossFit Level 1 seminar. I've done a ton of them. I used to teach at them. I'm no longer involved with CrossFit, but a buddy of mine and I, Kelly Starrett, had to go back and redo the Level 1 certification because it had been 5 years since we had done it. We went back to go do it, and we played a game with each other that we would do the group workout, which was thrusters at 95 pounds and burpees, and it was 21-15-9. And The deal is you could only breathe through your nose. And if you stopped breathing through your nose, you had to stop. So I went through this. I was by far not the fittest guy in that room, not even close. There are a lot of freaky kids coming up that have been doing CrossFit now, right? I probably finished in the top 5 of the entire seminar that did that because I was breathing through the nose, and because most people just go off the cuff way too fast and blow themselves out and then are so slow versus being steady and paced and being able to find a rhythm.
Interesting. So basically your body is fully utilizing oxygen the whole time. So you're not putting yourself in debt.
Yes, exactly. And that's what we're doing with the breathing prior to doing any training, is you're getting ahead of the game already.
Now, let me transition to the topic of mobility. So in your book, Unbreakable Runner, Strength and Conditioning for a Lifetime of Running Strong. So I've spent, my brother's a 4-minute miler. Now he's older, but he's a 4:30 miler. Another one is a 2:50 marathoner. I myself, I'm not too bad when it comes to running, but the issue is the injuries. And you brought this up in the book. What is the top 3 pieces that are most important for mobility when it comes to not the strength piece, but like the way you roll out tissue, the way you using like lacrosse balls and stuff? Can you explain that for our listeners?
So I did a post on this recently about what my dogs do after we're done playing. It's very different from what we do. In fact, I'm looking at my dog right now, who was barking in the background earlier, who's now laid out. We just took him to the pool, and I threw the ball, and they jump in the pool, grab the ball, bring it out. They're literally both laid out asleep right now. Okay? They're literally wired to shut down after they've just played, right? We are wired to continue to do other things and not recover. And so obviously, nobody's going to sit there and go, okay, well, I don't have the time. I'm not going to go just lay down and take naps after every time I go and train or I work out and et cetera. Well, if you're a professional athlete, that's literally the best thing you can do. And I can tell you from firsthand experience from probably 15 different sports that the best athletes in the world, that is what they actually do. So that being said, sleep is primary, rest is primary. And the reason I'm correlating this back to what you're asking about the tissue and rolling out is, when does my dog ever roll out? He doesn't. Yet his tissue is supple until the day he dies. Why is that? And my dogs are highly active animals. So what we are trying to do is get the tissue back to optimal, meaning there's no pain in the tissue. So if I were to roll on a lacrosse ball anywhere in my body, I don't have pain. There's no pain. If there is pain, that's a problem. And that is your tissue telling you that it's not getting enough nutrients. It's definitely not getting enough oxygen. So getting that tissue to open back up and become supple like a dog's tissue is ideal. So taking a lacrosse ball or a roller, and most people would probably need to start with a foam roller and progress through that and be able to get into things that are denser. But like I brought up Kelly Starrett earlier, he has a saying that any human being should be able to stand on top of your quads without you being in any sort of pain whatsoever.
Oh my God.
And I would say 99% of the population can't have that happen.
Yeah, the book he writes extensively about, I know what you're referring to.
Yeah. We are not optimal, and we think we're optimal. Let me just lay this out. You brought up Rise of Superman, okay? We literally take the 100-meter sprint. In 1912, that 100-meter sprint was 10.8. Mm-hmm. Right now, Usain Bolt holds the record at 10.58, I believe. The guy who won it in 1912 was wearing some weird, unorthodox shoes. He was on I'm guessing, cinder track.
Probably.
He was in a PE kit. Okay. Now we have Usain Bolt and everything specialized training plans. This guy had no salary, I'm guessing. I mean, Bannister was going to med school when he broke the 4-minute mile, yet 27 people after him broke it in the next year, I believe, something like that. It's all in Rise of Superman as well. The 100 meters, I don't think is, but they talk, Stephen Kotler talks about diving and how diving did a full 900 back in the early 1900s and how it took 100 years to actually like double that. Whereas you take snowboarding, you take free skiing, you take professional surfing. These guys have literally, there's no figures on statistics for the advancement they've made. And we get stuck in such dogmatic places thinking that it's all about doing more, and aren't paying attention to history, more or less. Chris McDougall wrote another great book on, I mean, it wasn't as good as the first book about the barefoot runner or the Tatamari Indians, but the second book.
The one in Greek that was based in Greece?
Yes, yep. yes. So his second book, Natural Born Heroes, is all about these things that people used to do 50, 60, 100, 200 years ago that nobody's talking about anymore, that nobody's even achieved. Like, you can't get an ultramarathoner to go, 10 miles without taking some sort of goo. Yet there are guys who are running back-to-back 50-milers with nothing but water. How are they doing that? Well, they're not ingesting a crap ton of sugar and getting their body ill-adapted to something that they don't actually need to use to fuel themselves. They just think they do because somebody's selling them on something for optimization. Yet, there's rocks, there's 1,000-pound rock or so that nobody's picked up in like 200 years or something. There's just things that we're not thinking about and seeing back through time. And it's like, look, if this guy back in 1912 who was running the 100 meters, if he had $20 million a year salary, was specialized in everything and had a serious training program, do you think Usain Bolt would still beat him? I don't know. Nobody knows, because 1.3 seconds ain't that much over more than 100 years.
So it's funny because I was when I got done with my Ironman, I think I was 194, and once I started this different training method, I wish I'd been doing this when I was doing the Ironman, but I now weigh just about that amount, and I felt, why was I so fat? Like, why was I so fat during my training? I was taking so many carbohydrates in. Is it so specialized nutrition, or can you actually follow some general protocols to kind of get your set point right?
Principles, man. It's all about principles.
Really?
That's it. There's no one program that is going to do squat. And what's entertaining right now is in the CrossFit world, a lot of people came into CrossFit and all they knew was like paleo or low carb diet, right?
Right.
That's all they ever knew. And then all of a sudden they heard about high carb and these athletes having phenomenal results on high carb. And they think they found this like holy grail of nutrition by using high carb. And yet they don't understand that we were there 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We were doing all that shit. Like, we were playing around with all of that. And the fact that you don't understand how to live by principles and think that there's these cheat meals and there's these other things, and this is, this just goes into lifestyle. What's your lifestyle? And what are you doing when nobody's looking, and what's your lifestyle about? If you think eating something that you wouldn't normally eat is okay to eat because you're training or doing a competition, there's just something fundamentally wrong with that. And so if I'm not willing to eat sugar, while I'm in a normal lifestyle of my diet, why would I ingest that while I'm training or competing? There's no real reason.
No excuse.
There's none at all. So the principles are that we live by, really. There literally is not enough vegetable matter that you can eat in a single day. So there's an infinite supply that starts at zero every single day. So your job is to get as much as you can of vegetable matter. High density leafy greens are obviously the optimal because they're most nutrient dense. And then there's lots of stuff in between and lots of fun stuff out there, and there's superfoods and all this stuff. But then there's, hey, what am I getting for my protein sources? And we know, based off of everything we've been doing, that animal protein is the highest density if it's been humanely treated, like non-stressed animals that eat what animals are supposed to eat, like grass, like, not grains, not things that we're trying to pump them full of, so we've got pastured animals or wild animals, things like that. You don't need to do it in excess either. It's not like most people I meet are eating way too much protein. So they're eating far more protein than they actually need to, and what happens to excess protein? It's converted to glucose. So you're basically just upping the sugar content of the system. Then it's high quality fats. Where are you getting your fats from? Are you afraid of fat? Are you still living under the guise that the high fat is going to give you heart disease? Because there's nothing out there that shows that. And it's all related to lifestyle and what it is you're doing. And yet the correlate that we've seen over time has been sugar. And I think that it starts there, where it's like, hey, sugar is number one culprit, okay? Number two would be processed foods, okay, which sugar falls into, right? And then, so getting rid of these things and just starting from eating real foods, things that were alive, especially relatively close to being eaten. Hydration is a major thing. Most people are well dehydrated. They're not drinking enough fluids during the day. I mean, my day starts with drinking water, starting with a tall glass of water with a little bit of salt in it so that I can absorb it correctly. It's living by these kind of standards and understandings. If you're going to eat bread, things like that, get high quality bread. Like, what's high quality bread? Well, somebody who hasn't stuck an alternative yeast or something in there to ferment it. Letting it ferment on its own and having a high quality bread is far different than something that has been processed and altered from the way that it's going to. Not saying that anybody should really be eating a ton of bread, but not everybody's gluten intolerant. I think Michael Pollan has done an incredible job with a series that he put out on Netflix called Cooked, which is a must-see for a lot of people. And I would say, even just based off of the way my wife and I eat and live our lives, that series that he did with Cooked is right in line with how we live and eat.
Mike Pollan is the name.
Yeah, Michael Pollan.
So maybe it's just easier for you in the West Coast. Maybe you just tapped into this community. But I went to my doctor, and what I found unique about your work is that you seem to tap into what is the current state telling me. Like, what is your body telling? Like, what's the current state of your body? So
yeah,
if I had to submit my blood and urine to a lab, what is it saying about my health currently?
Yeah. Well, what's your doctor asking for you to get? And does your doctor even understand? I mean, I just had this conversation yesterday.
I had to walk away from my doctor, Brian. And,
yeah.
And I had to go find someone else. And then basically he came back with, here's a bunch of foods that are inflamed. Stop eating the food. But then I went to another guy, and he said, listen, forget that. Both of those doctors. And he put me on this protocol to basically reboot my system over 3 months. But what is your philosophy about that? Like, how do you get people to the right people to get the right information about what their health is currently?
Ultimately, it's going to come down to you understanding these things.
Okay.
And that is ultimately what it's going to need to come down to. And the fact that you ask questions of your doctor that he cannot ask, yet he's divvying out advice on shit that he shouldn't be divvying out advice because he doesn't have the background or the understanding of it, which doesn't make me any more professional than him. But the fact that most doctors don't even have that, and you had to leave your doctor, yet this guy's handing out advice to people for what? He doesn't understand. Like when they don't know the lipid profile of the density of LDL cholesterol. Like a friend of mine just asked that of his doctor, and he's like, yeah, I guess we should test for that. And he's like, what do you mean I guess we should? How come I'm asking you this question and you're not telling me that? And then it comes back and he's like, he was told that his cholesterol was too high, but then the density of his LDL is really low and he's just fine. And he's like, oh yeah, I guess I should be doing it. Why aren't you doing that with every single patient? Why would you be giving them advice on something that's not true? And this is just how it goes. And so it's really you getting an understanding of what the blood work should look like. Throwing a curveball into here as well is a good friend of mine who's a doctor up in the Bay Area, works with a lot of the Silicon Valley guys. And one of his patients decided to do a blood lab on allergies to food. And he did it. And he got it back. And he was allergic to a bunch of stuff. And he's like, yeah, you know what? Just for fun, I'm going to change my name and I'm going to get the blood work done again. And he did that. And 2 weeks later, he had blood drawn, and 2 weeks later, he got the results. And he was allergic to a bunch of new different stuff. Isn't that interesting?
Oh, crazy. That is right? Crazy.
Yeah. And so we're just scratching the surface of a lot of things. I'm not claiming to understand any of this, but I try to pay attention to what's happened before or what's happening within nature. And what would nature be doing? And like, sure, we can grow the same foods year-round now because we can create a greenhouse and we're doing specific things, but looking at foods in terms of seasons and understanding real food. If it's diverse, if you're eating a diverse diet of real food, I don't think you're going to run into too many problems. If you're on a lot of different medications, I would be questioning why you're on those medications and what those medications are doing and how you can actually get back to ground zero to where your body is producing or developing the things that those medications are probably trying to do. And if your doctor's telling you there is no road back to that, I'd find a doctor that wants to find a road back to that. I'd find somebody who wants to find you a road back to not being on the medication. I just took two guys who are in medical school on the East Coast who came out and they're interning this summer with a PhD buddy of mine up at Cal State Fullerton, and Dr. Andy Galpin, and I took them through the breathing stuff. And right before we were taking them through the breathing stuff, both of them were telling me how bummed out they are with how they're teaching them what they're learning, is that everything is just about prescribing somebody something versus trying to figure out a way to get people back to eating real food and understanding that. And it's sad because this is the world we're living in now.
Well, literally out of her mouth was, there's no scientific, I only deal with stuff that has scientific evidence. That was come out of her mouth. So when I started, so what I'm encouraged though about is that when I listen to you and others that are kind of leading this charge and actually have protocols of ways of going about this, and I know it's not quite, we're not quite there with the health system yet.
Yeah. I think the simplest way is actually to get your genetics tested to understand from a genetic standpoint what you're predisposed to, what you're not, like what can maximize your gene, how do you express your genes to the fullest potential, and how do you suppress certain things, and what foods are related to that, so what diet would be related to that, and is there a way to manipulate things and do things within the natural spectrum of things in order to get there. I think getting your blood work done every year or two from a doctor who actually unequivocally understands all this stuff far better than you, that's what I do. I use a guy by the name of Dr. Justin Major who's in the Bay Area. I don't know how many people can use him because of his schedule, but I think things like Wellness FX, which does blood draws, which has these things, can direct you to doctors and people who are very open-minded and much smarter than me and who are on this path to want to understand how to get the human race back to, a better place.
Well, I just love this. And again, you're dealing with the technology of the body and working with people on this and the way to optimize it, human performance. So it's just refreshing to hear that there's alternatives.
Yeah, and I mean, it ultimately comes down to feeling too. And I mean, once you've learned how to clean things up, it's like if I go crush like some cupcakes or some cookies or something, what I feel after that is far different than what I used to feel. It's like when I used to drink,
right.
Like how I would drink and it was like, okay, I'd be hungover, but I just continued to do that, right? Or it was when I was eating really high carb and trying to get as many carbs as I could in because I was doing an endurance athlete and I needed all this stuff. Yet I couldn't understand why I was carrying more body fat than I thought I should be because I was training as much as I was. And yet when I cut all that out, oh my God, how good did I feel? And the response to when I actually did eat like crap or I didn't, I did something, and that's training as well. That's life. It's like, how do you feel? Do you feel what happens when you breathe? Do you feel what happens when you ingest something? Do you feel? And when you start to really get down to it, when you can feel, you're at the helm. You are running the show.
In response to the feeling, did you ever have people when they have urges for hunger or the urges to eat potentially need to be doing this protocol of breathing and abate the hunger that way? Have you ever had experience at all with anybody? I have experienced myself that when I'm getting super hungry, like around noontime, I will use the Wim Hof breathing, and it actually, I feel my hunger satiate. I feel like, you're fine. You don't have to panic about eating right now.
Yeah, that can happen. You can also get pretty hungry after doing it because the mitochondria gets spun up so hard. It's almost doing a workout, which, a lot of people talk to me about it and they're like, wow, this seems like it would be great for people who don't exercise. I'm like, this is the first step for people who don't exercise is to actually start breathing and get your mitochondria spun up and start. Mitochondrial biogenesis occurs within the breathing, and you're developing more mitochondria. You're developing a more robust mitochondria to start burning more fat, to start utilizing fat and oxygen more. And it's a way to it's free fitness per se. Okay, I'm not saying it's totally free fitness, but it will start to develop those things, and you can start to develop more of an aerobic ability with the breathing alone.
I totally agree. Well, I just have two questions more for you, Brian, and
Okay.
as we can get wrapped up here, it seems like you have been kind of you sort of help break down conventions of what sort of we've learned through the years and help us look at it from a different lens. One of the pieces was heart rate training for myself. Is that it's that old traditional from at Penn State where when I was running track there, it's 220 minus your age, and you take a percentage of that, and that's your ideal heart rate, and then you've got Phil Maffetone doing his 180 minus your age and that method. But if someone's using a heart monitor, is there general principles like you were referring to earlier, like principles of food? Is there principles of heart rate that you tend to counsel people with regarding?
Sort of. We do some metabolic testing to where we'll show people where they're deficient. My goal is to get people removed away from, I think technology has its place, but I think technology is what's happening is, and this goes back to this feeling thing, is we're using technology, we're starting to dumb ourselves down to communicate with technology. And that is a cataclysmic mistake. And people come to me all the time about heart rate variability training, all of that. And I've used it. I've played with it. I've tested athletes. We've done recovery protocols. We've created algorithms. And I got to tell you right now, the number one thing to deal with understanding your own body is feeling, is the ability to understand your mood. And when your mood is high and you're ready to do something and you want to and you're motivated and you're in it, it doesn't matter if your resting heart rate's high or low or whatever, the athletes still performed at the highest level, that were at the highest level. Then there were days that the mood changed, but the resting heart rate was good and they weren't doing things. I think the 220 minus age thing is an absolute hogwash. It should be eradicated. It's just something they're using for general public type stuff. But through the metabolic testing, we show people where they're deficient, where they could use some metabolic changes, whether they need some more fat adaptation or where their fitness fails, at their lactate threshold, where their aerobic threshold's at. And these are just small markers that we correlate by using the heart rate, and getting people to understand what the feeling is when they're at those markers. So that way, those markers on certain days you're more rested, those markers are going to change. Your heart rate's going to be able to go higher. On certain days when you're not as recovered and you decide to go out and train, those markers are much lower. It's a moving equation on a daily basis. It's not a one thing fits all. So it's kind of understanding all that stuff and being able to feel where those changes start to take place.
I love it. Well, my last question, Brian, is related to happiness. And I've heard you talk about happiness briefly, and I would like you to just, if you can give for me and my listeners, what your definition of what in today's culture is, and for yourself, what it means to be happy as a human being. How would you answer that?
I recently listened to something by Mike Rowe that he did on passion. And I think it's probably one of the most important things anybody should understand, is that happiness is not about picking something that you're good at. It's identifying where there's a need for something and where you can help, and I got into the industry I got into by mistake. I literally decided to sign up for an exercise science class in community college at a time when I had been in community college for 6 years on and off, never being able to make a decision about anything. And I had more credits in odd classes and odd things than anybody I'd ever had. I worked as a maitre d', I'd bussed tables, I'd washed cars, I'd done a lot of shitty things. But I enjoyed my time in doing all of those things as much as I could. And then I landed in this place where I was at, and I identified a need, and I identified that I was good at something and I could make a living at it. And I was happy doing it most of the time. And I literally took something and was able to apply passion to that something. And that's more or less kind of the moral of the story of finding happiness for me. Is just about, go to the third world. There are people who are so much happier than people that I see on a daily basis, and they have nothing, absolutely nothing. And it's just totally opens this entire thing up to what are we really motivated by. And money is something we all unfortunately need to make in this country to have somewhat of a living. That doesn't mean you need to, be frivolously spending money. But the fact is it's maybe that's what makes you happy. Go for it. Just make sure it's not a short-term thing. You know what I mean? But the fact is I think it all comes down to what you're doing for other people and where you find that need. And that's what a job is. And that's what things are. And that's what life is. I mean, any religion talks about it. It's all about helping other people. Every spiritual practice talks about it. It's about letting go of self, you getting into something and making the best of it and not thinking that I need to be doing something specifically.
Yeah, I love the message. And so people can reach out to you to learn more about your books in the XP Life.
xptlife.com or powerspeedendurance.com, and all that stuff's there. The big two books by Michael Pollan, he's got a bunch of them, but The Omnivore's Dilemma and In Defense of Food were those two books that I was talking about.
Oh, right.
They're phenomenal pieces. He also wrote the book Cooked, but there's a series on Netflix. I think it's a must-see by a lot of people. And at any rate, I don't typically get on a Michael Pollan.
No, it's good.
But they're great reads. I think Stephen Kotler's book on the rise of Superman is an absolute necessity for anybody who thinks they understand athletics or understand sport and start to really look at things in a different light and how things are progressing and how certain things are not whatsoever.
Yeah, what a great message. I appreciate all the resources and your message on passion and happiness and the resources in the book. So this has been great. And I wish you the best with getting things launched with XP Life with your pieces with Laird and Wim. So good luck with that.
Thank you. Thanks,
and
Bill.
Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
So there you have it, everybody. That was Brian McKenzie, and I hope you enjoyed that interview. I had a ton of fun putting that together for you. Make sure that you go to iTunes and Stitcher to leave comments about the program. It really helps tremendously. It helps me attract even better guests because the more popular it is, the more the guests want to be on the show. So until next time, have a great day. And this is Bill Murphy signing out. Bye-bye. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously, and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.